Everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our 8th virtual town hall. I hope you and your families are continuing to stay safe and healthy during this time. Every single day I hear from folks all throughout this district that are really having a difficult time, both with the public health aspect of this, but also with the economic impact of this. They're worried about being able to pay their bills, being able to put food on the table. And increasingly, as we get closer, certainly to July and November, people are also concerned about their ability to vote, right, in a way that is safe and healthy for not only themselves, but for the entire community. Unfortunately, there are too many in our state, and certainly at the federal level, that are working to prevent just that from happening, right? And so this is, Texas is very much at the forefront of this. We've got several cases making it the way through the court at the state level, at the federal level. And so it remains to be seen what vote by mail is going to look like, or what just voting in general is going to look like in November. So this is a topic that's certainly timely, but also just is wrapped up with so many other issues. For example, the role of money, big money in our politics, which is why I'm very honored today to be joined by Tiffany Muller and Representative John Sarbanes. Tiffany Muller is the president and executive director of End Citizens United, as well as Let America Vote. End Citizens United is a national organization that has really worked to make campaign finance reform and elevate that to a national priority. And Let America Vote is a national voting rights organization that works to make sure that voting is safe, is fair, and is accessible. Representative John Sarbanes represents the 3rd District of Maryland. He is the lead author of House Resolution 1 for the People Act, and he's also the chair of the Democracy Reform Task Force. So two not only allies in this fight, but absolutely leaders in this space. I'm very privileged to have them with us here today. And before we get started, we've got a couple of questions, Tiffany and Representative, that have been submitted from folks throughout this district. But just to put some context, again, why it's so important, what is happening today in Texas, and just ultimately why Texas in general is an important part of this conversation. I talked just earlier about the number of cases that are making their way through the court. But when you think about the fact that 3 of the 10 largest cities in the country are in Texas, right, or would be affected by these federal decisions. 1 in 10 kids in the country calls Texas home, right? We've got, of course, 38 electoral votes also at stake. Unfortunately, we've also have some of the most restrictive voting rights in the entire voting, laws in the entire country. I mean, you can vote with your student ID. You can vote with your gun license, but not with your student ID. You can't even register online to vote, right? And so again, these very restrictive, also vote by mail laws have people very concerned about what voting is going to look like. So thank you so much again for joining us. And I want to jump right into what we saw in Wisconsin and why this issue of expanding vote by mail is so critical. We've seen how people that were forced, frankly, felt like they had no other choice. If they wanted to have their voice heard at the ballot box, they had to do so in person. And the number then of cases that were very likely attributed to having to vote in person. So can you talk about just why it's important that we expand vote by mail, certainly from a public health standpoint, but in the interest of protecting our democracy?
Well, let me jump in first, Gina, and just say thank you for running for Congress. I'm very excited about it. You're a terrific candidate, and we're looking forward to getting another reformer to Washington to join the team that led the effort on H.R. 1, the For the People Act, and continues to lead when it comes to reforming our democracy. Nothing's more important in that mix than voting, as you just mentioned. And I want to also thank you for keeping it simple. I mean, it's just a matter of people being able to access the ballot box in the greatest democracy in the world. And that's what we believe as Americans. It ought to be easy, not hard, to get to the ballot box. It turns out that a lot of the measures that we included in H.R. 1, which were designed to make voting easier, are also measures that make voting safer. So without realizing it, the reforms we were putting forward really got us positioned well for this moment. We just got to follow through and get those things in place. Clearly, expanding vote by mail is critical. To stand that up across the country in places that aren't that familiar with doing it, it's going to take some resources and some training and sort of deploying it in a very focused way. We've put significant funding into the HEROES Act, which we passed in the House last week, and we hope in some form or fashion will pass the Senate ultimately after some negotiation. But that funding is in there, significant dollars to support expanding vote by mail, to make it easier and safer for people. But there's some other things that we need to do so that come November, if people want to cast their vote, they can have confidence they can do that. So it's not just vote by mail. We need to have early voting opportunities, and we need safe in-person voting opportunities as well. So the HEROES Act has funding that would allow all those things to happen and ensure that people in America, in Texas, in every other state in the country who want to exercise their franchise can do that without having to run an obstacle course and without having to do what the folks in Wisconsin had to do, which was sacrifice their health and safety in order to exercise their right to vote. That's not the kind of choice we should force people into. And your advocacy on this is critical in Texas to make the point that we can have a safe, free, and fair election in November, but we got to put the resources and the focus behind it. So thank you for being such a champion on this.
Absolutely. A lot of attention is spent, as it should be, rightly, right, on the First Amendment, the ability to be able to say something, right, and your free speech. But I think just as important is your ability to be heard, right? And so when I think of voting, that's exactly what that is, right? Your ability to be heard, regardless of your age, of your gender, of your race. And so thank you for your leadership on this issue. Tiffany, did you want to add anything to that before we go on to the next question?
I think first, thank you for having me today. And it's always such an honor and privilege to get to do events with you. We can't wait to have you in Congress, and we're going to continue doing everything we can to help make sure that you are part of the reform class that makes HR1 law and that we actually get Washington working for the people again. And part of that is making sure that nobody has to choose between their health and their right to vote. Voting is absolutely an essential part of our democracy, but it shouldn't be dangerous. And the fact that we've seen approximately 70 cases of coronavirus coming out of the Wisconsin elections and the chaos of that shows why we have to start preparing today and give people as many opportunities as possible to vote safely. And Congressman Sarbanes did a fantastic job breaking that down. But yeah, very simply, we are advocating for a vote by mail option for everybody, extended early in-person voting. So we really spread out the time that people can go in and also make it more convenient for folks who maybe typically work on election day or have different hours. And then making sure that folks who actually vote in person on election day, that it can be done safely, cleanly, and securely. And the most important part of that is that we have to make sure that states have the resources to implement and be prepared for that prior to November. And Congressman Sarbanes and the House just passed $3.6 billion in the HEROES Act that would help make sure that states could be fully prepared by November. But Senator McConnell is once again sitting on his hands and not letting it come to a vote. He would much rather pass corporate bailouts than he would actually pass what we need in order to keep people safe.
Or appoint more people like unqualified to sit on the federal bench.
That's right.
Critical to people being able to vote by mail being successful, like expanding that, is the role that USPS plays. And in a district that is larger than 30 states, this district goes from San Antonio to El Paso. It's, again, larger than 30 states. USPS plays such a critical role in our rural communities. It's the way they get their groceries, it's the way they get their medicine, for example, but it's also the way that they vote, right, and cast their ballot. So can you talk a little bit, Representative Sarbanes, about the assistance that's being provided to ensure that USPS can provide that function in November?
Well, thanks for that question, Gina. And you're absolutely right. The U.S. Postal Service, leave the election aside for a moment, all the other functions that it performs are absolutely critical. And we know the American public has a high opinion of the U.S. Postal Service because it polls at like 85–90% approval. Particularly right now, people have a deep appreciation of what the postal workers are doing in order to keep people connected to the larger world. So for a long time, I've been focused as a member of the Oversight Committee, which has jurisdiction with respect to the Postal Service, on the needs, the funding needs to make sure that it's solvent. We know that in this moment, because of coronavirus-related loss in revenue, they're really under the gun. So again, the HEROES Act, which we passed, would put $25 billion of emergency funding behind the U.S. Postal Service. And obviously that's going to be critical if we're going to lean on the post office to help with the vote by mail opportunity. So those things go together. It's why we've included both of those pieces in the HEROES Act. And I just want to mention, if you talk to election officials across the country, it's Republicans, Democrats alike among those officials who are clamoring for this support. This should not be a partisan issue, even though some try to make it that. This is a matter of patriotism. The right to vote is something we want to deliver to everybody, regardless of their political stripe. We can have a free, fair, and safe election in November. We got to put resources behind it, and keeping the post office strong is a critical part of that.
Absolutely. So I want to take a little bit of a broader look at the important work that your organizations do, Tiffany, as well as the other things that are so important that are identified in HR 1 that are critical to reforming campaign finance laws and protecting voter rights. So Tiffany, can you shed a little bit of light on the other things that ECU and Let America Vote are focused on, and why it was important that the two organizations recently come together?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. This feels like a very softball question for me.
You're a good softball player from what I've heard. So
second base all day, every day.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we are tackling, in Citizens United and Let America Vote, are tackling two of the biggest problems that are facing our democracy: big money in politics and voter suppression. And really, this is about how, and you said this earlier, Gina, this is about how people's voices are heard, right? And how we actually participate in our democracy. Mm-hmm. Right now, most Americans feel like Washington is working for just a few big special interests, rather than on behalf of everyday hardworking families across the country. And they're not wrong. That's absolutely what's happening. And so what we do every day, we are a grassroots funded organization. We have 4 million members across the country. And what we're trying to do is really end the dominance of big money in politics and make sure that everyone has the right to vote. Mm-hmm. And so earlier this year, we actually merged those two organizations. And that's mostly because, look, these problems are really interconnected. The same people who are flooding our system with unlimited and undisclosed spending and trying to buy elections are often the same people who are trying to make sure that people's voices aren't heard at the ballot box, right? And so this is about resetting those levers of democracy. And if our problems are interconnected, our solutions really have to be as well. And it's one of the brilliant things about HR 1, and Congressman Sarbanes did such an amazing job shepherding that through the House in 2019 and really developing and being the architect of that bill. But it says, look, we have to make sure that government is working for the people, that we're ending big money in politics, that everyone has the right to vote, and that we're ending gerrymandering. In Texas alone, we could pick up probably 4 more congressional seats if we had independent redistricting. So right now, during this fight in this pandemic, Let America Vote is working every day to make sure that we are putting pressure on particularly Senate Republicans who are holding up this election funding, and trying to make sure that people's voices are being heard. So we just launched, actually today, we launched a almost $500,000 TV ad buy, asking people to call their senators right there in Texas. I hope people will call both Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz and demand that they support this. I know that might feel like a wasted call, but let's do it anyway.
I was going to say, people are going to call. It's a matter of whether those two are actually going to make sure anybody picks up the phone.
Yeah, and send emails, and we have to put pressure on them. Without putting pressure on them, they absolutely will not act. So we're doing digital ads, we're doing a TV ad buy, we're doing texting programs across the country, peer-to-peer texting programs, we're doing email programs, and basically we're asking people to join us and get involved. So for folks who want to, go to letamericavote.org and please get involved. And then the most important thing we're doing is trying to help elect reformers like yourself, right? Because we know what really matters is changing the leaders that we have in these elected positions. And we saw that with the House last year, that not only was HR 1 the very first bill that was introduced and co-sponsored and passed, but then we saw that followed up by lowering prescription drug prices, passing universal background checks, right? Equal pay for equal work. All of these things that are priorities to people's everyday lives, we can tackle if we first get the special interest out of our public policy debates.
Right. Absolutely. And I think if, there were greater transparency around all this money in politics, people would be very surprised at the entities that are interested in hearing from them at the cash register, but not at the ballot box. Right. Yeah. That's fundamentally what some of this comes down to. And we've seen it during this pandemic. Again, this is the 8th virtual town hall that we've done, but we've seen how special interests have affected our community's ability to respond to, for example, the uptick in domestic violence, right? The Violence Against Women Act that passed over a year ago, that is unfortunately sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell because there are too many senators that lack the courage to vote to close the boyfriend loophole because they are too wedded to the special interests that don't support common sense gun reform, which is what, again, the vast majority of Americans support. But that's a real way in which the lack of courage there, because they're so wedded to these special interests, have affected our ability to help domestic violence victims during this pandemic. Similarly, when we're talking about, again, having worked in national security for nearly 15 years, am amazed, continue to be amazed by, I'm sure, like both of you are, that we haven't used the Defense Production Act to make sure that we have the resources, whether it be about testing or contract tracing or PPE. There were early reports that much of that was due to significant lobbying by these corporate interests that did not want to have to be beholden to that, even though that was in the interest of our public health and the interest of states like Texas not paying 3 times the cost for a COVID-19 test, which unfortunately we're having to do because we don't have nearly the supply, right? So when people talk about why do we need to take big money out of politics? Well, because they are preventing the things that we care about in our every single day, in every day of our lives from becoming a reality and helping working families.
Yeah, I'll throw in one more quick example because I think it's one we hear about almost every day. In 2017, Big Pharma got $76 billion in a tax break, and they didn't pass any of that savings on to people struggling with prescription drug prices. Instead, prescription drug prices have continued to go up, and they did stock buybacks and dividend payouts and CEO bonuses, right? So even when given money to invest, the people who are invested in are the CEOs and executives.
Absolutely, which is why I was really honored to take Citizens United No Corporate PAC pledge, right? I mean, this is, people have to have faith in your ability and to vote in the community's interest and to hold yourself accountable. And I think that means being as transparent as possible, which is why I've taken the No Corporate PAC pledge very proudly. Representative Sarbanes, would you talk a little bit, sir, about some of the other things that are encapsulated in HR 1 that are so critical, not only to bringing greater transparency, but more effectiveness to our campaign finance reform?
Well, to get to your point, Gina, about who owns our politics, who owns the government, who owns the policymaking apparatus, is it special interests or is it the people? And unfortunately, over the last few years, the cynicism out in the public is well-founded because they look at Washington, they look at how laws get made, and as Tiffany was saying, too often they see that lawmakers lean in the direction of the money and away from the public interest. You just made a very strong case around how to connect the dots. Increasingly over the last few years, People have connected the dots. They know the reason that we can't rein in sort of toxic chemicals and other stuff that affects air and water in this country is because you've got big industries that are standing in the way of public policy. The reason, as you point out, we can't get common sense gun measures is because you got the gun lobby that's standing at the door with their arms folded, barring the door in terms of sensible policy. And the list goes on and on and on. Doing right in terms of the economy with fair tax policy, not giveaways like we saw the Republicans do 2 years ago. That's a clear example of where the special interest made it abundantly clear to lawmakers, if you don't get this done, we're not going to fund your campaigns. That's not right. That's not what the average person wants to see. So one of the most exciting parts of H.R. 1 and this transformative reform package is to create a whole new way of funding campaigns that's based on small donations and matching funds, so that if you're running for Congress or president, you can support and power your campaign by turning to everyday Americans. You don't have to go hat in hand to the lobbyists and the deep-pocketed special interests. And what's great about that is then when you get to Washington, the only people you're beholden to are those constituents, the broad public. You don't owe the lobbyists anything. You don't owe the big corporations. You've made it clear you don't want to be in that position by taking the corporate PAC-free pledge. We need people to assemble where laws are made who are independent of special interests and big money and are only fighting for everyday Americans. And building this small donor matching system that we've created as part of H.R. 1 is the way we can succeed in doing that. So that's a critical piece, because that's about ownership. Who owns the thing? Who owns the democracy? Who owns the system of making laws? Let's make sure it's the people that own it, not the big money and the special interests.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I think a key part of that, look, as somebody that's a first generation American raised by a single mom, proud product of public education, you know, my entire career has been in public service. That certainly isn't the background that lends itself, right, to the resources traditionally needed to run for office, right, just to be frank. And so I think the important piece of efforts like HR 1 is that by introducing other ways to finance these campaigns, you also open this field up to folks that would say, I can't do that. I remember one of the very first questions I got was when I thought was expressed interest in running for this was like, well, can you raise 300K in 90 days? I'm like, well, that was the first question. It wasn't, why do you want to serve? It wasn't, what have you done? Why do you think you are the best person to represent your community? What are you going to fight for? So I was taken aback by very early on about the role, right, that money would play in running for office, which is why I'm committed, again, to the No Corporate PAC Pledge and to making sure that we've got greater transparency around our campaign finance laws. This is, I mentioned this is a district larger than 30 states, right? So when you talk about gerrymandering, we are absolutely at the forefront of that. And unfortunately, I think what it does is dilute the voices of so many communities, right? When you're able to pick which voters you want. So can you talk a little bit about how both ECU and Let America Vote, as well as your efforts, representative as part of the task force, how you're working to address the issue of gerrymandering?
Yeah, I mean, look, it starts from a really simple premise of that people should pick their public officials, not politicians picking their voters, right? And we were just talking about Texas is one of the states that is the most gerrymandered and would likely end up, if we had independent redistricting, would likely end up in a position where there were at least 4 other congressional districts that were competitive and, that communities could truly have a voice for the first time in a long time. First of all, HR 1 includes a provision around independent redistricting commissions, which is we have seen what a huge difference that can play in states that have implemented that. And so that's a huge part of what we're pushing for and what we believe is needed. The other piece is, you know, it's 2020. It is census time. And I know right there in Texas, you also have a real chance to flip the legislature and a real shot at it, right? And the redistricting responsibilities that come with that in 2021. So we need everyone, particularly in communities that are often underserved and not heard. They all need to fill out the census. We need to help flip these legislative districts in the state. And we need to push for federal legislation that would require independent redistricting. So, because yeah, this is one more piece, right? You have money, you have voter suppression, you have gerrymandering, and they're all working together to keep people from being heard and to keep special interests in control. And we have to break those policies.
Absolutely.
Gina, I would just say it's another incredibly powerful component of the HR1 package. If you look at the things in there, they're all poll at 75, 80, 85%, because all Americans want this, and they can't understand why we can't get it done. And the reason is that for too long, the people that got to Washington immediately got captured by a power structure that pushes against these reforms every single day. What was amazing about the class of 2018 is they promised when they were running that if they got to Washington and if they got the gavel back, this would be the first thing they did. And they actually followed through. I mean, this is about believing you can actually fix a broken system. And they demonstrated, if you send us and if we have the power to fix our democracy, we're going to do it. And they did it in the first 100 days. Unfortunately, we don't have that same group on the Senate side. So HR1 and all those terrific reforms, that kind of big bang moment that we could see in terms of delivering our democracy back to everyday Americans, it eludes us because Mitch McConnell doesn't want to see it happen. Why would he? This is the power structure he's built over the last 3 decades. So he wants to be the immovable object, but HR1 and the power that you bring and other reformers bring can be that relentless force that can overcome that resistance and make sure that we get this done. The most important thing I can leave the folks on this call is believe that this can happen. We've shown that if the right people come to Washington and they have something to get behind on behalf of the people, they'll follow through. We just got to finish the job now by continuing to send great people to Washington. Gina, we need you on the team because we know, just listening to you tonight, we know you're going to be the leading edge of this kind of thing and deliver for your constituents. So we got to get you there and we got to keep pushing and ultimately get this done for the people.
Absolutely. Well, Representative Tiffany, thank you so much for joining us. As we know, we've talked a lot about some of the challenges and some of the obstacles, but the good news is, right, this is all fixed by us voting, right? Us showing up and voting and making sure that everyone in our homes are registered to vote. And we will continue to be vocal about our desire to do so in a way that, again, doesn't threaten anyone's health. But thank you so much for the work that you're doing now, for the work that you're continuing to do to, one, take big money out of politics and ensure that voters are heard at the ballot box. I wanted to offer just a couple of, some time for closing remarks. Representative Sarbanes, if you wanted to say some closing comments.
Well, I just want to thank you, Gina, for being a leader on these issues. You've been doing this for a long time. You understand that it's simple, like I said. When you talk to people out there, here's what you hear. Let me get to the ballot box without running an obstacle course. That's all the voting reforms that we want to put in. Protect our democracy against foreign interference. That's all of the measures that we want to put in to combat meddling and hacking into our elections. When you get to Washington as lawmakers, behave yourself. That's all about the ethics and the accountability and following the rules. And we have a lot of those provisions. And the last thing they say to us is, when you get to Washington, don't get tangled up in the money. Remember where you came from. Continue to represent the people. It's pretty simple for folks out there. We just need to follow through. If we can get you to Washington, We're going to get you on that team. You're going to be leading that team. I just beseech your voters, make sure this happens. We don't want to lose this opportunity to get somebody like Gina in Washington and fighting this good fight. So thank you for inviting me on, and we're going to continue to stand together.
Thank you.
Well, I will also take a moment to give some closing thoughts. You know, we hear almost every election cycle that this is the most important election of our lifetime. And that is never been more true than it is right now, right? November 2020 is the most important election of our lifetime, and the stakes couldn't be higher. And this seat and you running are one of our best opportunities to flip a seat blue. You know, for all the people tuning in, if you don't know, Gina came within 926 votes of winning this seat last cycle. And with Will Hurd retiring, she is poised to become,
yeah, so we like to give credit where credit is due. So my team says we scared Will Hurd's ass out of this race.
I love it. I love it. Sent him packing, and now it's time to send Gina to Congress. Look, but we need all hands on deck to do this. We know that outside interest will come in. We'll try to keep this seat. And we need each and every person on this call to do what they can to help bring Gina over the line. So there's a link in the chat. Please volunteer if you can. Join the team. Make sure you're registered to vote. Make sure your friends and family are registered to vote, that you have a plan for voting. And if you can, please donate what you can. Gina is running without the help of any corporate PACs. She has taken that pledge, but it means she's relying on grassroots donors to power her campaign. And we are super proud to stand with her, but she needs all of your help too. Gina, we can't wait to get you to Washington. Like the Congressman said, you are gonna be the leading edge of this. It's always such a pleasure to join you. I really appreciate you having me on today.
Well, thank you so much again to both of you for your leadership. We look forward to winning, and most importantly, we look forward to this district finally being well represented. So thank you so much. And for those of you that took so much time to be with us this evening, thank you again. I hope you and your families continue to stay safe and healthy. Take care.